We have a early position limp. Don opens up to 15, Joe flats and Josue flats. I look down at pocket eights in the big blind. I think my hand makes a very reasonable candidate to just call here the vast majority of the time. I'm getting a very good price, and I don't expect the early position limper to generally be 3-betting in this spot. I do think that my pocket eights are ahead of most of my opponent's ranges here though. And although this hand plays fine multi-way and I kind of know where I'm at, I think I would prefer to try to get this pot heads up or take it down generally. It's much harder to win hands multi-way. So I do decide to squeeze to $80. It folds to Joe and he is the only one that makes the call. The pot is 195 and we go to a flop of ace of spades, 2 of diamonds, 2 of spades here. I think this is a spot where I'm generally just going to be checking with pocket eights. It definitely can bet a small frequency just because specifically pocket eights is one of my weaker pocket pairs here and it benefits from denial of overcards, where a hand like something like pocket kings or pocket queens would be much more of a pure check. I think if I do continue here, it would always be for a small sizing on this dry ace high board. I do decide to make the check with the pocket eights, and action is on Joe. Joe has flopped a monster draw here. He has a straight flush draw. I believe that in this spot, Joe has been relatively wide thus far early in the session, as we can see from his call pre-flop to a 3-bet squeeze. I do think that Joe would continue here with all of his gut shots and a decent amount of his backdoors at the very least, including a good portion of broadways. I think he would continue with some of his suited connectors that miss after I check here as the pre-flop raiser, and then obviously all of his flush draws. He's gonna have a little bit of 2x, even though he has a relatively wide range. I wouldn't expect too much 2x in his range, but it's definitely possible that he has a hand like king deuce suited or 3 deuce suited. I think the remaining part of his value range is mostly made up of ace x combos. I don't expect him to have the strongest ace x combos because I do think he would have 3-bet those pre-flop. Joe does decide to continue here with a bet of 150 into 195. I think my hand is a pretty pure call, especially with the spade here. We go to a turn with the pot at 495. The turn is the 7 of spades. Joe makes his flush here. From my point of view, I think that this is a okay turn card for me. I do pick up a spade draw, which gives me outs to Joe's ace x combos often and his few 2x combos. So now I have any spade or any 8 against those hands. Specifically with pocket eights as well, I am blocking some of his stronger flush draws from coming in. I think it's less likely that he would be bluffing with a combo that contains a naked 8 of spades compared to bluffing with broadways that contain a single spade. Obviously, I'm in a rough spot if he has a strong ace x with a spade as well, though. I think versus a small sizing, my hand is going to be a high frequency continue. Unfortunately, Joe decides to bet 400 into 495 here. I think exploitatively, I decide to make this call where I would normally be folding. I do think that Joe would continue with his gut shots here. I do think that Joe would continue with some broadways here, especially if they have an ace. When I make this call for 400, I'm essentially committing the rest of my stack as Joe only has 348 behind. So I know that I will have to call the vast majority of rivers. Thankfully, the river is the wonderful 8 of diamonds. We check, Joe shoves all in with his flush, and we snap call. I open up ace of spades, five of spades from early position, and the only player that continues is Joe with 7-6 off in the big blind. We go to a flop of $75, and the flop is the 3 of hearts, 10 of hearts, 4 of diamonds. My hand specifically can mix bet or check. I do think I have some showdown value, but picking up a draw and having an overcard as well makes this a viable betting candidate. I do think that overall this board connects slightly better with the big blind, but I still have a strong advantage overall with all of the overpairs and the stronger top pairs. I just have less of the sets and 2-pair combos that I think Joe would have here. I do decide to bet. I think I can use a mix of sizes here as well, anywhere from about 33% pot to 75% pot. I go with 35% pot, and he continues. I think at this point, I expect his range to be made up of 10x, some 3x, some 4x, and then some straight and flush draws. I don't know how often Joe is going to be floating with ace high here, although he probably should with at least a backdoor flush or backdoor straight draw. We go to a turn with a pot at $75. The turn is the jack of spades. Joe makes the check, and I decide to check back here. I think this is a turn card in hindsight that I'm supposed to be continuing at a high frequency. The Jack X realistically only hits the portion of Joe's range that contains the Jack of Hearts, where I have a lot more of the Broadway region that would have hit this Jack. I also still contain overpairs and strong 10x here that I think can gain value from some of his draws and his weaker 10x. The river is the 5 of clubs, giving Joe the nut straight, and Joe leads out for 85 into 75. This is a relatively difficult spot for me. I take a little while to contemplate this one. My hand actually makes a pretty amazing bluff catcher in the sense that I think when Joe uses this sizing, he's very polarized to air or a very strong hand like 2-pair plus. I do not think that Joe would be betting here with a pair of 10s for this sizing. My specific combo with the ace of spades, 5 of spades here, it doesn't block any of Joe's flush draws. It doesn't block any of Joe's backdoor flush draws. I block some of his 2-pair combos like 10-5, 5-4, and 5-3. I also don't block very many of Joe's straight draws, which often contain a 6 or a 7, and I think he's bluffing less with the ace-high combos. I do decide to ultimately make this call. Unfortunately, Joe shows us the straight, and he scoops this one. I open Queen of Hearts, 6 of Hearts in the hijack. I think this is a wide open in this spot, but I have been card dead, haven't been playing a lot of hands at this point. We're about an hour and a half into the session, and this is the 3rd or 4th hand I've played. I do think this is probably a poor open versus the field that is flatting a lot of raises pre-flop. So I don't know if I would do this again in hindsight. I get a call from Johnny in the cutoff and a call from Elijah in the big blind. We go to a flop with a pot of $62. Thankfully, the flop is the Jack of Hearts, King of Hearts, 2 of Hearts. So I flop the second nut flush here. I think there's an argument to checking or betting this hand. Pretty much exclusively going to be using 33% pot on monotone boards. I think this hand is probably going to be a continue at a slightly higher frequency with the low kicker heart blocking a lot less of my opponent's continuing range. I think versus 2 opponents, they often still have 1 heart combos, straight draws, King X, Jack X, and a small frequency of 2x that can continue against a small sizing. I do decide to make the bet, and I bet $20 into 62. Johnny calls with the Jack of Diamonds, 8 of Hearts. We go to the turn. The pot is now $102. The turn is the 3 of Diamonds. This card shouldn't affect either of our ranges. Due to the relatively blank nature of the turn card, I decide to size up and I bet $75 into 102. I do expect all King X combos to continue here. I expect some portion of Jack X combos to continue here, especially if these pairs contain a heart. I also expect some single heart combos to continue, especially if they have a straight draw to go along with their flush draw. Johnny does make the call. We go to the river with the pot at 252. The river is the 2 of diamonds. A relatively blank card. I don't expect Johnny to really have any sets or 2 pairs that filled up on this river. I would expect most of those to be raising on the flop or turn. It is possible though. My hand definitely wants to be going for value here. I think specifically with the stronger flush combos, I can use an overbet sizing, especially with the 6 of hearts. That doesn't really block his continuing range to a large sizing here. I do decide to overbet. I would be overbetting here with some of my missed straight draws and primarily my missed flush draws. I expect to mostly just be getting hero called here by stronger King X combos and then King X and or Jack X combos that contain a decent heart. I don't expect too many weaker flushes to be calling here, but I think it's a slight possibility as well. Unfortunately, Johnny just has a Jack with a medium kicker. It's a reasonable bluff catcher, but he quickly folds, and we pick up a small pot of $252. We have a straddle to 10. Noah opens to 40 from early position, and we have multiple callers. It gets to me in the small blind, and I have King of diamonds, 10 of diamonds. I think my hand can 3-bet at some frequency, but I don't think I'm necessarily going to have enough fold equity versus this many players. My hand also plays relatively good multi-way, being a suited, somewhat connected hand. I also think if I call here, I don't expect Courtney or Johnny to 3-bet at a high frequency, which makes the call slightly better. I decide to make the call. Courtney overcalls and Johnny overcalls. The pot is $240 and we go to the flop 6 ways. The flop is the 9 of diamonds, 4 of diamonds, 4 of hearts. So we flop a flush draw and 2 overcards. Courtney checks and it gets to Johnny. Johnny decides to donk bet shove 400 into 240 with his 9-6 suited. It folds back around to me, and I think I have a pretty clear rejam here. I only have Courtney in between me and Johnny, and I think jamming is going to be better than calling, just in case Courtney has 9x holding. I think for the most part, Johnny's going to have a lot of 4x combos here, and I have typically 8 outs against his 4x combos, assuming that one of my diamonds isn't good. And then anytime he's donk betting a 9x combo, I have 16 outs. And then if Johnny's ever shoving a worse flush draw, which is definitely possible, I'm in really good shape. I think it's a hand that I clearly want to go with in this spot. As we can see, I have 43% equity against his holding, so I have more than enough equity to make this play. Unfortunately, the turn comes out a offsuit 8, and the river comes out an offsuit jack, and Johnny picks up this 1K pot. I open up queen of spades, 10 of spades from early position to $20. Don makes the call on the button. Don has been relatively loose pre-flop, but once he has seen a flop, he has been very passive and tight post-flop unless he has a very strong hand. There's been a couple instances throughout the session where I thought Don had a pretty clear call and or raise, and he's decided to tank call in a couple spots. So I think when Don is putting money in the pot, he is usually going to be very much weighted towards strength. We go to a flop for $47. The flop is the Queen of Clubs, 9 of Hearts, 9 of Clubs. Generally, I'm just going to be checking a large portion of my range out of position to the button in this spot. I think I'll be doing a little bit more betting on Broadway boards, but generally if I want to play my hand aggressively, I'm going to be playing it as a check raise. I do make the check here, and Don bets $20 into 67. I think my hand is a pure call at this point. A decent top pair. I do block some of the straight draws. I do not block any of the flush draws. I think I would be raising with possibly some of my stronger Queen X, definitely a good portion of my 9X, and then some straight and flush draws on this board. We go to the turn with $87 in the pot. The turn is the 6 of clubs. I continue to check. Don tanks for a little while, and he checks back. I expect Don to be betting a high frequency of his flushes and full houses on this turn card. When Don checks back, it feels like he more often has showdown value, but is afraid of possible flushes that came in. So I think he's very much weighted towards stronger Queen X and 9X holdings. The river is the 5 of spades. Again, I make the check. I think against most players, there's definitely an argument to betting small here, probably around 33% pot, trying to get called by some weaker Queen X and hands like pocket 10s, pocket 8s. I do not think that Don is one of those players that I'm necessarily going to be gaining thin value from. I also think that Don has still a relatively strong range against my Queen 10 at this point. I don't necessarily think that Don is going to be bluffing very much on the river, but I think that all of his hands that have not made a hand will generally check back and I will win the pot. Don thinks for a bit and does bet 75 into 87, a relatively large bet. I think he's very much weighted towards value. My Queen 10 against his value range is essentially dead. My 10 blocks some possible bluffs that he could have, although I do not think that he's bluffing at a very high frequency. I think when Don bets here on the river, he is very heavily weighted towards 9X and possibly some stronger Queen X, something like Ace Queen. I don't think he has very many bluffs, so I think my hand exploitatively becomes a fold against him. This is probably one of the worst hands I've played in a while. Let's see how it goes. We have a early position open from Johnny to 35. Definitely on the larger size with $5 blinds. There's no straddle in this hand. It folds to Josue, who makes the call on the button. And I look down at Ace of Spades, 10 of Diamonds in the small blind. Not a hand I really want to be playing multi-way. I expect that if I call, Courtney is going to call in the big blind at a high frequency. I decide to 3-bet to 165. In hindsight, I don't know if this is a very good play. Even though Johnny has been loose thus far, he's still opening under the gun and to a large sizing. So I don't know if my Ace 10 is doing as well as if he had opened up in a later position or to a smaller sizing. He makes the call. We go to a flop with $370 in it. The flop is the 8 of Hearts, 2 of Diamonds, 8 of Spades. I think this is a flop that I have a massive nut advantage with a lot of the overpairs and a strong range advantage. So I do think I will be betting this flop at a high frequency, and I'm going to be primarily using a 60% pot sizing. My specific hand probably wants to be checking at a higher frequency. I'm still ahead of some of his Broadway combos and his weaker ace-X, as well as some suited connectors. But I do decide to bet. I bet 175. Johnny thinks for a little bit and he makes the call. Once Johnny makes the call here, I do think that he has a lot of pocket pairs in his range. He's going to have a little bit of 8x, but I would expect some of his 8x to be raising here. Same with pocket 2s. So he's definitely weighted towards pocket pairs. I do believe that Johnny would float with all of his ace high backdoor flush draw combos and possibly some of his king and queen backdoor flush combos. We go to the turn, which is the 4 of diamonds. At this point, my hand is probably supposed to just be a give up for the most part. I think there's some merit to continuing at some frequency when the diamond comes and I'm holding the 10 of diamonds. I still do have a massive nut and range advantage. The 4 of diamonds doesn't really improve either of our hands. It can definitely bring Johnny a straight draw and or a flush draw, but it's rarely going to actually improve his holding unless he has pocket 4s. At this point, I make a pretty large error. I look over at Johnny's stack and I actually miscount it, and I think he's got a couple $100 more than he actually has. I end up betting 340 into 720 with the plan to jam some rivers. Unfortunately, Johnny jams all in, and due to my miscount, his jam is only for $664 more. So I only have to call $324 to win a pot of just over $2,000. I think this is actually the spot that I made the smallest error on this hand, even though this looks really bad. I'm getting incredible odds to call this all in. I do believe that Johnny has some hands like ace 3 and ace 5 that I'm ahead of. I think he has ace high flush draws that I'm ahead of. And I think he's got a small frequency of king high and queen high flush draws that I'm ahead of. I also believe that for the most part in this spot, my ace and 10 is relatively live unless he has 8x or specifically pocket 10s. Unfortunately, he does have specifically pocket 10s, so my percentage is much lower. But with the odds that I'm getting in this spot, I really don't think my call is too horrendous here if I think Johnny has any flush draws or straight draws at this point. We saw one of the previous hands, him shove relatively wide with 9-6 on 9-4-4. So I do think that Johnny's capable of having a somewhat wider range here than many players would. Again, assuming my ace and my 10 is live, I have almost immediate odds to make this call. I do make the call, and the river is the king of clubs. Johnny shows the pocket 10s and we muck. We have a straddle to $10, and Connor opens what is essentially under the gun to $30. I look down at ace of spades, jack of clubs. I think this is a hand I would generally be 3-betting in this situation, but I am going to be 3-betting at a lower frequency versus a under the gun range. Connor also recently sat down at the table, so at this time I don't really have any information regarding his tendencies or his ranges in this spot. So I decide to make the flat. Will flats behind in the +3 position. I think that Will would be squeezing a good portion of his Broadway combos in this spot. He's had a tendency to play relatively aggressive preflop, especially versus slightly more capped ranges. We see 2 more calls behind, and we go to a flop 5 ways with a pot of $152. The flop is the king of spades, ace of clubs, jack of spades. The blinds check and Connor checks. It gets to me, and I think that generally I want to be betting this hand with a very polarized range. My overall range consists of a lot of suited connectors and weaker pocket pairs for this Broadway region. I think if I do continue, I want to be betting on the larger size on this very wet connected board. I bet $90 into 152, and Will makes the call. I think when Will makes the call here that he's very unlikely to have a combo draw. I think most of his 10x of spades combos would be raising here. I also believe that the vast majority of his queen 10 combos are going to be raising here. And like I said pre-flop, I don't expect him to have a very large frequency of stronger Broadway combos here because I think that he would squeeze them. I think most of his range at this point consists of weaker top pair combos, some flush draws, and he'll still have some of the other Broadway hands. I think at this point his range consists of primarily one pair combos, either top pair or the hands that make a pair and a straight draw that he decided not to 3-bet with pre-flop. Hands like king 10, queen jack, jack 10. I don't think that he would be continuing with any of his weaker pairs at this point with multiple players behind. I think he should still have a relatively strong range when he continues here on the flop. The players behind fold and we go to a turn with the pot at $482. The turn is the Queen of Hearts. Not the card that I am happy to see when I'm sitting here with two pair. I think on this turn card that brings 4 to a straight, the vast majority of my range is just going to be playing a check. I'll have a low frequency of bets with my value that consists of almost exclusively straights, preferably ones that are unblocking his hands like top pair, and my bluffs will consist of some flush draws. I do proceed with a check here. Will thinks for a little bit and he bets 150 into 332. I think my hand is a pretty pure continue. Although Will does make some straights here, I think he also has some flush draws. I think it's possible that he is also betting some two pair. That's worse than mine, although I think that that is unlikely. Regardless, I think my hand is pretty much just a pure call at this stage. I don't think I would be doing any raising with any part of my range. We go to the river with a pot of $632. The river is the 9 of clubs, which doesn't really change anything. I check, and at this point, if Will decides to bet, he is very polarized to straights or a hand that is much worse than mine. He would not be value betting any two pair or sets on this river, especially for large sizing. He does decide to bet 385 into a pot of 632, and the action is on me. Very, very difficult decision here. I have to make calls here at some frequency with my two pairs. I do think that Will is very capable of bluffing in this spot. Typically having a spade in my hand would be bad, but I do not think that the ace of spades plays a large part into that because I do not think that Will would be bluffing if his hand contains the ace of spades. When Will bets here, I think his straights are going to be king 10, jack 10, or 10-9 primarily. I think it's less likely that he has a hand like ace 10 as played. I think all of his queen 10 combos would be raising on the flop. And I think I can discount some of his king 10 and jack 10 combos as well because I think that they would squeeze pre-flop. I'm not sure at this point if Will would just continue with any 10x on this flop with three players behind him to act, but it's definitely possible. I think if Will had the 10 of spades, we would have seen a raise from him previously. So overall, I discount a lot of his 10x. I have seen Will flat a lot of suited connectors overall at this time. So I do believe that he has more flush draws than many players would have in this spot. Ultimately, I do decide to make the hero call. He shows the 9 of spades, 6 of spades for a busted flush draw, and I show my top two pair with ace jack, and we scoop a pretty large pot to end the session. Overall, the first live stream was a success. I made $559. I had a lot of fun playing on stream, and I'm hoping to continue to play on the Prime Social stream every Friday going forward.